Welcome to our on-demand webinar, Surviving a Data Breach. We recently held a conversation with a panel of experts who have been through the worst-case scenario, breaches that exposed customer data. We asked them for their advice and their lessons learned to help you build stronger breach prevention and response plans. My name is Heather Smith. I'm the head of marketing at SpyCloud, and I just want to introduce you to us for a second before I kick you over to the recorded conversation. Now, you may know that the use of weak or stolen credentials is the #1 attack vector when it comes to breaches. And so our focus at SpyCloud is on ensuring that your users, whether they're consumers, employees, or even third parties logging into your sites, are who they say they are, and not a bad actor leveraging stolen credentials. And we do this through the earliest possible collection of data from third-party breaches. And that enables us to tell you very early in the attack lifecycle whether your users are exposed. And we can automate the remediation of those exposed passwords to lock down the accounts, prevent fraud, stop the theft of corporate assets, sensitive PII, customer data, and financials. But billions of users are already protected by SpyCloud. And if you're not, you can be. You can send it for free breach monitoring at spycloud.com. Just put your email address in, and you can sign up for that to get a taste of SpyCloud's data and the power of what we can do for your anti-fraud efforts. Now, the conversation is moderated by Chip Witt. He's our VP of Product Management, and we chose him because he's frequently interfacing with security leaders and practitioners and our customers, bringing those insights back to help us drive the product strategy and roadmap. So he's a natural fit to kind of guide this conversation. But I'm going to kick you over to the recording. I hope you enjoy it. Please reach out if you have any questions, and thanks for your interest. I would love our panelists to introduce themselves. So why don't we kick it off with Harry? Just tell us a little bit about your background and your previous role, and then we'll go to Damien and we'll get the conversation started.
Well, great. Good morning. Thank you. Well, I currently run a consulting practice called Oak Advisors that is the intersection of healthcare and information technology. And we mostly do strategy work. I also sit on the board of 2 healthcare IT private equity-backed companies and 2 nonprofit healthcare companies. But what we're going to talk about today is my work as CIO of CareFirst Blue Cross Blue Shield. So let me ground you a little bit. CareFirst is an $8.8 billion company. They have about 3.2 million individuals who are covered by their health insurance. And we had about 5,000 employees and contractors, plus another 1,500 to 2,000 onshore, offshore workers. So very, very large IT operation. I ran that for almost 7 years. The IT spend when I left was a staggering $425 million in a combination of lights on infrastructure, day-to-day, and project work. And in that time, we had a breach, which is the focus of today.
Thank you, Damien.
Good morning, everyone. Damien. Good morning, everyone. Damien Taylor here, former Chief Information Security Officer at Landry's, which is a restaurant company primarily, but they're also involved in casino gaming, online gaming, some entertainment venues. They also own the Houston Rockets. So, I'm going to talk about my experience in navigating a breach during my time there. Currently work for the federal government at the USPS Office of Inspector General, where we perform IT audits, penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, you name it. So I have a small team there. And just a little background of Landry's. Again, kind of a multi-venue, multi-faceted company that is involved in several aspects. Most notably, they are the one to 2 top private restaurateurs in the entire nation, with several different brands that folks have probably visited over the years. I will say that the employee count at the time of my employment was approximately 50,000 employees. We had a pretty large size enterprise that was particularly focused on point of sale transactions in 600 plus restaurants.
Thank you both. I wanted to actually start this off with just my personal commentary. I think we would all agree that no one wants to be in a breach. I think that's
Right.
actually what's drawing a lot of interest to this particular webinar is the fact that there's a lot of mystique around breaches and how to respond appropriately, especially in a leadership role. And your experience and being able to talk about that is extremely valuable, and I do appreciate it. So I think we're doing the entire security community great service with this experience that you're sharing with us today. So thank you very much. Damien, the Landry's breach that we're talking about today took place before your arrival. Can you share a little bit about how it was discovered and what was entailed?
I can, yes, sure, Chip. So approximately 2 months after I took the position as the CISO at Landry's, we started getting complaints, customer credit card fraud. We had some weird network issues going on in our point of sale environment. So the official way that we knew it took place is we hired a third-party firm. They came in, they did a forensics investigation, and sure enough, the confirmation that there was a breach going on, collected artifacts over time, and then through that third party, we were able to put together a summary timeline of events on when it potentially started and when they left the environment.
Very good. Harry, as the CIO of CareFirst during the breach that took place in 2014, can you tell us how the breach was discovered as well as the type of attacks that took place?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I need to ground you for a second in CareFirst, because CareFirst is a Blue Cross Blue Shield company. We're one of 36 independent Blue Cross Blue Shield companies around the country. So if you remember back in 2015, when our breach was discovered, before that, a couple months, Anthem had announced a breach, another Blue Cross Blue Shield company, with 80 million members data was breached. And that set off all kinds of alarms in Blue Cross companies around the country. And one of the things that alarmed us was the fact that Anthem announced that the perpetrator had been in there for weeks exfiltrating data without their knowledge. So we immediately brought in a third party and began to scan our environment. While we were scanning our environment, Primera announced they were breached, and they lost 11 million customer records. So we then discovered through a complete forensic analysis of our entire IT infrastructure and applications databases that we had indeed been breached a year earlier in 2014. In the same time frame that Anthem and Primera had identified their breach occurred. The same company did the forensics for all of us. It was traced back to state-sponsored Chinese terrorists or bad actors working for the Chinese government, and that's who we believe perpetrated us. But it was discovered through a complete forensic analysis of our complete IT environment.
Are you able to share with us the type of data that was taken, Harry?
Yeah. I mean, we were very, very lucky because they got to a small database that was the credentialing database for our member website. So it was only name, address, date of birth, and the member ID. What we were lucky was there was no social security number, there was no credit card data, and there was no medical data. And from everything we could tell, they took one file that contained the member credentials for logging in the website.
Very interesting. I think that Damien, you articulated the type of data that was exposed, but did you want to elaborate any further on what was exposed in your breach?
Yes, sure. So like Harry, the breach, once the timeline was definitized and established, come to find out that the breach had been occurring, a year prior to my arrival, a year plus. That data that was stolen was primarily credit card data. So if you bundle that up, whenever you swipe your card, if it's not using a chip encryption or some end-to-end encryption, you're going to get your name, you're going to get the credit card number, the CVV code, and expiration date. And so there were millions of those credit card pieces of data that was stolen by this malicious actor.
Wow. Something that's always interesting is kind of understand how criminals operate. And we all know that there's a lot of reconnaissance that goes into criminal activity before they actually act. Can you talk about anything that was gleaned in either of your cases about how you were surveilled or how the attacker identified your company as a target? And maybe Harry, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story because you can go back to that period and read articles in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but there's a belief that the Chinese were gathering data about American citizens and building some kind of master repository to profile us. That's the thought behind these large attacks, and healthcare companies were specifically targeted. None of the data from our breaches appeared on the dark web. So, and the same thing with Anthem and Primera. So we think it's for some other purpose, and you can go back and look at these really interesting articles. What occurred with us was a very targeted phishing email sent to about 70 employees. They were all people identified to likely have elevated privileges. So we think they probably found this on LinkedIn, targeted. A lot of people put their work email on LinkedIn as a way to contact them. So about 70 employees got the email. We quickly identified and shut it down, but before we did, one person had clicked through, and it was a network administrator. And we thought we knew about that. We knew that employee clicked through in real time. We thought we had shut down what occurred, but the software was essentially so fast in downloading and then transversing the network with our credentials that we missed it. So that's kind of the heart of what occurred, but it all began with a very, very small number of targeted phishing emails sent to specifically identified employees.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Damien, how about in your case?
So in our case, I think the surveillance took place over a number of months. And they identified us as a target primarily because there was a financial interest in the adversaries. They know we were in the business of accepting a bunch of credit cards. We had a bunch of restaurants. And so how they were able to get into the environment, we did not determine specifically, but it was likely a phishing email targeted to several employees. And once that happened, the detection mechanism, unlike in Harry's case, the adversarial technique was occurring in a memory state only. So there weren't a bunch of malicious binaries floating around our network. The scripts that were being used were resident only in memory. So our AV, which is only looking at file signatures, weren't able to detect it at the time.
Oh, okay. So we all know that every IT or security professional operates with the assumption that they're going to be breached at some point. So we go with that in motion. We put plans in place. So Harry, what had you and your team done already to prevent a breach from occurring in the first place? And can you elaborate this from a technical and from an education perspective?
Well, let me just start with the education. I mean, we always had, probably for the 5 or 6 years before this breach, security education that was mandatory for every employee in the company, and phishing email training was a part of that. But unfortunately, it was a once-a-year exercise. But we had thought, we had a great team. We had thought we were making the right investments. What we kind of learned in the process that we weren't making enough, and the scale of the investments really needed to grow dramatically. But we were right in the midst of segmenting our network when this occurred. We were right in the midst of encrypting all data at rest when this occurred. We had a project on the plate that hadn't started to use something called jump servers for our network, and anyone with elevated credentials to get into our servers. So that kicked off right after this occurred, but that was already planned. So I think many of the pieces we had were the right pieces, but occurred. We weren't fast enough to get them all implemented. That's probably the best way to say it. I think we were on the right track. We had all the right things lined up, but the scale of our investment and the time to get them deployed was what we accelerated dramatically after the breach.
Okay. So let's actually accelerate the timeline. We've been talking about kind of the pre-breach. The breach has occurred. Damien, can you talk to us a little bit about what immediate steps were taken to remediate the breach once it had happened?
Sure. So once we figured out the scope of the breach, we formed a sort of a tiger team, because I had a small IT security team, so we could not go and do the remediation actions all on our own. So we pulled in some system admins, some network engineers. We also grabbed some third-party attorneys to kind of work with our PR and our legal team to help shape the message that we were going to send out to employees. So you had very parallel actions going on. But from a technical perspective, our Tiger team went out and did cleanup through scripts of deleting files after we archived them or saved them. We got some assistance from a third party. We reached out to our security vendors that we already had in place to develop signatures, brand new signatures that would block this particular threat. So that was the immediate steps. And then we went through and did sort of a validation after the cleanup to make sure that we hit all the affected endpoints that were affected in the breach.
Harry, can you talk about your experience there with remediation?
Yeah, so there was a number of things that happened in parallel. I mean, I immediately created a breach response team, and we pulled together key executives from legal, from privacy, security, from the business, and began to parse through the data we were getting from our forensic IT security vendor about what was occurring. And if you've been through this, you often know that information doesn't come out immediately. It comes out over time as they discover what's occurred. And it takes a little time for that information to get flushed out. So we were assimilating that. We began immediately to accelerate, as I mentioned earlier, planned IT programs, and got approval from our CEO to essentially double the security spending and move things at a very fast pace. And then we began to build the narrative of what happened, because we needed to communicate out to the federal government, to the state of Maryland, to DC, Virginia, to our employer groups who buy insurance, to all the individuals who are covered with our insurance. They all need to be communicated to. And so getting that message clear, getting the timing of those messages put together, there was a whole program to figure out how do we get the word out. And some of this was contractual. We had certain times by contract that we had to notify certain customers. So we had to line all that up. And then from a technical perspective, we immediately began to blacklist certain web addresses from our environment, any offshore addresses from our environment. We began to accelerate the network segmentation program for key systems that could be impacted. So there was an immediate response. And maybe lastly, we did have email scanning software in place that should have picked up the malicious link, but it didn't. So we immediately pivoted and began looking for a replacement. So all of these dynamics kind of came together all at once, with kind of all hands on deck, both from the leadership perspective and from the IT security team and our infrastructure teams.
Very good. You both alluded to the fact that you got legal teams involved and other key executives. Can you elaborate a little bit further on how the company as a whole handled the external communication with media, parties who filed lawsuits, et cetera? I mean, there's a whole cacophony of concern around that. How was information controlled? And Harry, maybe you can just sort of continue off there.
Yeah, so as I said, we created this breach response team, which were top executives in the company. And we began to create the messaging of what had occurred. Once we discovered the full story, we began to craft it into how do we tell this story, because it's a complex technical story. How do you translate to English? Right. We put together essentially a storyline. We reviewed it with our CEO repeatedly to make sure he had the language and he understood it. And he was fantastic. He asked a million questions. And then for all press communication, our CEO handled that, with me and our chief counsel sitting in the room, to add color if necessary. We also had to handle board communication. We also had a schedule of how and when each customer got communicated to, because as I mentioned, there were certain customers that had to be communicated to by contract within a certain time frame. And so the deployment of that fell to key executives in the company. some of those key executives hadn't been involved in the breach response team. So we had to bring them up to speed. We had to educate them in the process so they could communicate to their customers. So there was that wave of education of getting them in, letting them ask a million questions, explaining the story, giving them a set of talking points so they could, stay on message, and beginning to then roll out the communication plan. Now in terms of lawsuit, there was one or two lawsuits that happened later. It didn't happen right away. And I believe they've now been settled. It's been a couple of years since I was deeply involved in CareFirst, so I believe they've been settled at this point. But because, as I mentioned earlier, there was no credit card data, there was no health information, there was no social security number, the lawsuit action was fairly minimal. We were lucky, we just, as you say, dodged a bullet with that.
Very good. I can imagine with the whole communication and executives being looped in as needed, did that change anything in regard to your processes in terms of communication internally around those things and education ahead of this as part of your normal process?
What we did is we developed a whole plan and framework for how this would be dealt with in the future. So we actually documented in real time what we were doing to become the basis of a future plan for the company should this ever happen again. Because when there's a challenge of when do you let the cat out of the bag with your leadership? I mean, everything's happening so fast. It's not a long period of time you're keeping it quiet, but you've got to figure out, you don't want it to get to the press before you're ready. And so you really, we were very careful who knew what until we really understood what had occurred and were ready to tell the story. But when I say, I don't mean this was a long period of time at all. Those movies where time gets compressed and you're going so fast, but it's like in slow motion. That's what this was like, because there was so much happening in a very, very short number of days, but it felt like weeks till we were able to, because we were working around the clock to get ready to make public what we had learned.
Right. Damien, same question in terms of, can you share how you and the company as a whole handled the external communications? Any differing story in terms of different from what Harry shared?
Maybe slightly. So obviously, any kind of data breach, there's different laws and mandates in several different states. So what we did was our legal team put together one unified message between the legal and the PR team, and that was posted on the corporate website, right? Informing customers what happened, who to contact, those sorts of elements. And then the states, based on the laws there, some states require mailings to go out to contact the different customers. We also had a big reporting requirement for our payment card processor. So whenever we were a big PCI shop, and as such, there's some reporting requirements there whenever a breach happens. And then also we hired a third-party legal team that specializes in IT security issues, breaches more notably. And so they have navigated those sort of challenges previously. So they worked with our legal team, they worked with the security team, our CFO was involved, and they helped us navigate some of the requirements there. I think the other piece that's important is to have a flexible capacity to handle requests that come in. So our call center was kind of beefed up a little bit to be able to accept customers, an increased volume of customers calling in, asking about the breach, and we had a pre-established communication strategy for individual customers calling us.
Very good. Damien, that's actually a great segue into kind of talking a little bit about lessons learned. Maybe you can start off and tell us what big strategic shifts did you make as a result of the breach, including any new investments, budget allocation, maybe program prioritization, team organization, et cetera. Anything come out of this as lessons learned other than what you just described?
Definitely. I think with anybody who undergoes a breach, most anyone, you'll find as a security leader that your ability to obtain additional resources becomes a lot easier right after a breach. And so with me, there were some things that I had on my strategic plan to address risk in the environment, and I was able to get the funding to purchase those. a couple of things such as a better, because we were using a very antiquated old secure email gateway. We got a new one that was more intelligent. It used heuristics and those sorts of things. We got approval to, or we implemented two-factor authentication, which wasn't in place when I first got there. You know, we updated our firewalls. We updated a lot of the major our secure web gateway, because again, we were using a very old one that wasn't configured properly. So we got the best of the breed secure web gateway, because from my perspective, the biggest threats are, you know, user interactions. What is the user getting in their email? What are they clicking on, or where are they going at on the World Wide Web? And so again, I was able to get some budgeting prioritization, and I was able to get additional manpower to help address the breach cleanup.
Very good. Harry, how about with you? Any strategic shifts in your case?
You know, let me start with education, because it's kind of the simplest thing. But as I mentioned earlier, we were doing annual security training, which was useful, but not enough, because you forget about it the moment it's over. So we introduced weekly emails from the security group, short little blurbs with educational tips, with a very high focus on what individuals could do to protect themselves and protect the company. As I mentioned earlier, we accelerated our project plan. So we put together 30-day, 60-day, 90-day deliverables, and got an influx of cash. And Damon, you know, applied never waste a good crisis. So we also accelerated our security plans dramatically. I think things like two-factor authentication, those were in the mix or in the plan, were just beginning to be rolled out. For example, they got accelerated. The network segmentation got accelerated. The jumps over program, which was just about to start, got accelerated. So, and I don't remember exactly when, but sometime after that, we put in a new email scanning software. One of the shifts we made in that time was to try and move to cloud-based vendors to buy these things as a service versus implementation. It's faster time to market, and we could pull them out quickly if we didn't like them. So some of these tools that help protect you, you don't really know how good they are until you get in there and have them in your environment. Right. So we thought we had a great tool for email scanning and protecting the company. It wasn't good enough. And so buying it as a service now, we could plug it in quickly. And if it wasn't good enough, next time we could pull it out quickly and go to somebody else. So that was a lesson learned too. A big shift to cloud-based security vendors, or and security as a service to help us.
That's a good point. Modularity and layered security kind of go hand in hand. Yes. Yeah. Damon, you alluded to the fact that you free-flowing budget at the time of crisis, and that's always the way. How did that change over the next 12, 18 months as things got further and further from the breach? Can you comment on anything about that?
Yeah, so, you know, I will say that, so in typical corporate organizations where, you know, they're profit driven, the focus on things that don't produce revenue is less than those that do, right? So I say that to say, after you have a period of time elapsed where things look secure, and there's no, you know, big issues that are taking place, the attention and the importance from the senior management, senior executives, it starts to become one of those things, out of sight, out of mind. Okay, we spent money on security, we're good to go now. We don't need that focus anymore. So I'm not going to give Damien any more money for these other things that are on his list of, you know, important items to address.
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing that keeps coming up in conversations that I have is that security is a cost center, whereas criminals operate as profit centers. When they're attacking you, they use resources and spend money to attack us in creative ways, but we're having to defend based on a cost-based model, and sometimes those are things that get cut easiest, so kind of a scary thing. Harry, when you are advising companies now in your current role, where you're on the board and can advise them, how are you advising them in terms of fund allocation for cybersecurity programs? Anything changed with regard from your experience here?
Well, Yeah, I think Damon just said it, but when you're trying to start a business or you have a small company, it's hard to focus on cybersecurity.
For sure.
And so, I think we've got to make it a priority in companies. And the challenge for smaller and mid-sized companies, they don't have the resources to really do what it takes to protect their environment. So it's not just telling them to focus on cybersecurity, which is one dimension, but also helping them understand how they can get protective services at the right price. So, leveraging their co-location data center vendor to buy as a service wraparound security services, or their cloud vendor to buy as a service different security services. And I try and dissuade them from building things from the ground up because they simply don't have the money to do it right. So the more they can buy as a service, the more they can get existing vendors that they already have in place to provide these wraparound services. And then it just gets baked into the cost of operations. That's kind of what I push. But I do push it because it's so easy to think we're too small to get picked on, or it doesn't work that way.
Right. Do any of you have any advice specifically for security teams on how to demonstrate return on investment as they're making a business case for a new vendor, security vendor, or solution?
Yeah, I would say don't use ROI. It's because you can't do it. There is
Right.
no, if you're starting a business, you wouldn't forgo liability insurance or business operating insurance. You wouldn't forget to buy insurance for your business. So why, you have to think of security as a cost of doing business, not a return on investment. And if you try and get measured that way, which a lot of people want to put it into, tell me why this project's justified. Tell me what you're going to save by implementing this. No, I'm going to protect you and save you, from losing millions of dollars later, or losing customer confidence, or losing your reputation. What's the cost of that? But if you've got to reframe the discussion away from ROI, because you'll never win there.
Damien, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I agree with Harry there. So, ROI in the security space is extremely hard, and everybody who attempts to demonstrate it, they use the same sort of metrics, right? There's an organization that shows you what the cost of a breach is, but that's not universal, and it's not something that is going to be resonating with everyone. Well, let me make sure you guys can hear me, because I see that the screen froze. Okay, we're good to go. The way I did it was I try to describe it to the CFO folks in terms that they can understand. So I take a bank, for example, right? A bank has valuable assets, right? Money, those sorts of things. And their only security measure is not going to be, the equivalent of a firewall, a locked door, right? There may be a badge, there's monitoring, there's other security controls in case something happens. There's a means to identify a perpetrator in the event they do go and steal assets. So I try to make that relations. But how I determine what I'm going to put my energy towards to reduce the risk, I use a very simple means. So there's an organization called Center for Internet Security, and they have a top 20 list of security controls, right? And so if you're at an immature or an organization that has an immature security posture, that's where I would start. It's 20 controls. They're broken down sort of in tiers, 3 different tiers, and you want to get after the top tier first, then go to the second, and then go to the third. Now, prior to my job at Landry's, I was a CISO in the DoD in uniform, and we had the NIST framework, right, which is a lot more complicated. And I going into the Landry's job, my idea was to use NIST, but it's not mandated, number one, for private industry. Number two, it takes a relatively large staff and an ongoing effort. So I chose to get after the CIS controls, and that dramatically increased the security maturity of the organization over the time I was there.
So if I can just double click on that a little bit, Damien. So was it that the NIST guidelines are more complex, that they require more staff, and that the CIS was a little bit simpler in terms of how to approach it, or what was the fundamental difference there that made it easier?
It's simpler to approach it, simpler to get those small wins, right? So if you can say, number one, one control would be visibility of environment. Well, how are we doing that? So it's easier to explain. It's easier to say why you're doing it, and it's less overhead trying to accomplish those controls. Whereas when I was in DoD, I had a staff that was a lot larger. We had a bigger budget, and oh, by the way, the larger DoD said you have to do this. At Landry's, nobody said you have to do anything other than meet the PCI compliance, which we all know compliance isn't necessarily doesn't equate to security.
Sure. Both of you in your conversations alluded to education and employees. I mean, we all know employees can definitely be the weakest link within your security infrastructure. How do you think about the human attack surface now, and what can a security leader do to solve for this challenge? Harry, do you have some input there? You're muted, sir.
Thank you. Certainly there is education. We've talked about that, and I think it's got to be regular and frequent, and it's got to be engaging. And we actually introduced a whole like cartoon security training as a way, and people loved it. I mean, they loved it and they remembered it. And then we followed that up with these weekly security little blurbs to kind of get on their radar. And I think also you've got to kind of take away as much from their plate as you can, because they'll never be as sophisticated as your security team, your general employee population. They'll always be a threat. So you've got to continually upgrade your tools to prevent that malicious email from even getting to them, or a malicious site they shouldn't go to that needs to be blocked. And that the tools to do that are out there. The vendors vary in quality that do this. So you've got to be continually upgrading those tools to keep the bad stuff from getting to your employees.
Damien, did you have thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, like Harry, we had an annual security awareness training. But what I also did in addition to that was make sure it was updated based on recent threats. So malicious actors, they weren't only sending phishing emails. We had instances where malicious actors were impersonating law enforcement officials, calling our restaurants and trying to trick users into, agreeing to send a money order somewhere or something like that. So continued employee awareness. But even if you have 100%, if you're touching 100% employees, they're still gonna mess up, no matter how much training you do. That's one thing that we know. Secondly is communicating the awareness effectiveness to the board. And the way I did that was I used some very high level metrics and some self-imposed phishing simulations where we tested different user groups, high risk user groups, folks who had access to credit card data, or they had access to petty cash, or those sorts of things. So we had to focus that training on them. One of the things that I was not successful at in that particular endeavor was, what do we do for repeat offenders, right? What disciplinary action can be imposed? And that's a tough one, right? So,
Right.
You give a person, you tell them not to do something, they do it anyway. You tell them again, remediated training, and they still do it. I used the analogy to the CFO, and I said, hey, look, sir, if I go out of this fire escape and it results in the corporate office fire alarm going off and everybody has to evacuate, you may forgive me the first time. But if I do it again and I do it a third time, there's something that's going to happen to me. I don't know what that is. I could be fired. I could be, put somewhere else, relocated, whatever the case may be. But you're going to have some action. But I was never successfully able to get our legal team or our CFO folks to agree to what that action would result in.
Yeah, it's interesting. This comes up as a point of conversation at a lot of the meetings that I have with CISOs and other security leaders. Is many people hold that user education is a wrong approach because it very often does not bear much fruit in terms of solving the problem. And that's actually the real challenge. Is how much do you invest in user education if that isn't actually solving the problem? So I think it has to be a mixture of using the right technologies too to make sure that the problem doesn't get the users, as Harry mentioned earlier. I think that that's pretty key. But you know, it's anytime you make something a security process that's user proof, the world just goes and makes a more surprising user, and you then have to contend with that person and their particular problems. Kind of extending that a little bit further, right now we have a world situation where we have a lot more people working from home due to the pandemic. So the lines between work and personal life are blurring. Habits, if you're in the work office, you have a certain attitude, you carry that with you into the office and you conduct yourselves accordingly. But if you're working from home, that line is very, very much blurred. From your experience with your breaches that you survived through and that context, how do you think that needs to be addressed by security leaders today? Harry, you want to go first there?
Yeah, I think one of the simplest tools out there is a virtual desktop, and
Oh yeah.
we mandated at the time because CareFirst had a large work at home population. Particularly, we had enabled every call center person to work from home if necessary in a snowstorm or some kind of event. So we had locked down virtual desktops that segmented what you were doing from your own work, so your own personal work. So you might have been operating it on your personal computer, but you couldn't download data to your personal computer from the virtual desktop.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, depending on their role, you might not be able to print. So we took various means in how we configure the virtual desktop to make sure that data that was confidential wasn't leaving the company. I've talked to a number of friends through this pandemic, and I'm kind of shocked because so many companies were unprepared for an event like the pandemic. So they had no work at home infrastructure. So people are using their home computers. They're working on their home version of Google Docs or Microsoft Office. They're saving work product locally in their own personal folders. And it's a very scary time because the company is losing all of that data, that historic data that gets generated in the normal course of business. And it's sitting in personal repositories around the country. So I think many companies were ill prepared for this. And I'm finding even companies, I have a friend who works at a very large entertainment company. And what he says is, well, when I have to go onto the virtual desktop is only for like the payroll system or the expense system I do, but everything else is just easier to do in my own version of Office. So that's where company policy is missing to mandate how these things are done, because they really weren't prepared for this kind of event. There should be a requirement that everything gets done on the virtual desktop, but many companies don't have those structures yet to kind of establish how work is done at home.
Mm-hmm. Damien?
Yeah, I would say that, I previously mentioned, and as did Harry, two-factor authentication, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you are working remote and you're connecting to a corporate environment and you don't have two-factor authentication, that's number one. You got to have that, right? Are there ways to get around it if you're an adversary? Sure, there's some novice or novel techniques out there, but for the most part, that's a big win if you can make sure that any VPN connections remote are two-factor. Secondly, what I like using now is what's referred to as always on VPN, right? So anytime I fire up my workstation, my corporate government workstation, it's connected to a VPN. So it does two things. One, obviously the data is protected from my network to the corporate network, but it also eases the access to the end user, which is something you always have to keep in mind when you're levying security controls on a particular system or access for that matter. And then secondly, I am a big, I push back hard on any kind of BYOD other than, basic email or something to that effect. There should be very few reasons why you allow a employee's personal computer to connect to your corporate IT resources. Very, very small. And then secondly, when users do connect, or thirdly, when users do connect, one of the things that we implemented is once they're connected to the VPN, they're all dumped on the same VLAN. So there's no confusion of, okay, these customers on the 100 or these employees on the 100 VLAN, are they remotely connected or are they on the 5th floor? Everybody that connected via VPN, they're all dumped in the same VLAN. So we have we have ease of identification.
Yeah, that's all great points. One of the things that's really kind of come up as a topic of conversation in a lot of recent days, especially with the pandemic, is that anything that creates friction. Used to be when you talked about friction, you talked about it in terms of your customer base, right? You can't introduce anything that's going to create too much friction and maybe prevent a sale or prevent a flow through of a transaction. I think increasingly, especially amid people working from home and having to be productive from home, is there's that same fear in the business of introducing friction for the end users that then prevents them from being able to be productive and do the business of making money for the company. And so that's the other, I think, big kind of other side of this coin, is that we have this security needs, but we also have to do it with the being mindful of those friction concerns for the rest of the business, which is an interesting balancing act for sure. One of the things that is just sort of interesting, you both are great professionals doing great work out there, and I'm always interested to hear what's on your reading list, what podcasts you're listening to, what types of things that you're doing. Maybe share that with some of our listeners. Harry, do you have any of your top lists?
Well, one of my favorites is Krebs on security. It's a newsletter that comes out whenever he writes something, but it's always insightful, and it's always you can go back and read those historically. They're great. So Krebs on security.
Great. Damien, how about you?
There's an ISC2 podcast called Storm. If I'm correct, I'm not sure if I got the name right, but I listen to it probably once every other week, and they talk about current events, current threats, remediation, who's been impacted. So it's a little bit more technical than Krebs, but I also take a look at Krebs because he seems to be able to get the information before anybody else does.
Exactly.
I'm not so sure how he does that, but he seems to always get it even before your PR folks have released the information.
Very good. Well, thank you you're both very much. I see we have Heather back on screen, so she probably has some questions for us from the audience.
I do. We've gotten some really interesting questions. I would love to start with this one that came in for Harry. So Harry, you referenced that none of the customer data actually leaked to the dark web. How were you able to verify that that was the case?
We were searching really for a couple of years for specific dumps of this data. There were companies we use that actually had arms that researched on the dark web looking for any of our data. We never found it. And that was true for the other blues I mentioned as well, those big three breaches, Primera, Anthem, and Care First. We never found that data showing up for sale.
And Damien, that was the opposite case for you, right? You were able to verify that it was being sold. And my question that I'm reiterating from an attendee is, they wanted to know about this time frame compression, right? This idea that like it feels like hours for you, but it's really months. But can you comment on the amount of time between when you learned that the data was leaked to when the customers were informed, or was there sort of was that a very long time frame? And Chip, I'd love to hear your comments on this too across our customer base, what we're seeing in terms of the actual breach taking place, the data leak, and then the informing the customers.
Yeah, so our dark web data that was discovered was a two-part. It was me searching, and it was also because there's some popular forums where certain types of data are sold, specifically credit cards in our case. And credit cards have a shelf life, right? So they have to sell them quickly. There's also some third-party organizations in the financial sector that have teams that monitor dark web channels. And so they also were able to see that data being sold on the dark web. I will say the timeline part of the question is some of that is mandate focused or reliant, right? So I'll take California, for example, right? California has a very strict data breach guidelines. So for California, we had to notify the customers, for example, within the first 30 days. Another state, it might be 45. And so in our notification, the notifications came out before we discovered that data being sold. And so for some folks, it was following up after we learned out additional information.
Got it. That makes sense. So yeah, Chip, I think this question expands into the, when the breach actually happens and when we hear about it publicly, what is that length of time typically that we're seeing?
That's a great question. What we typically see is breaches occur by a more sophisticated criminal set. They conduct a breach, collect their information, and begin to figure out how they're going to leverage it financially, how they're going to build an economy around it. And this often happens with a very, very small subset of criminals that don't share the information on the deep and dark web. In fact, when we talk about deep and dark web and spy cloud conversations, we consider that to be public internet. If it's on a pastebin site or it's accessible via the deep and dark web, it's not addressable internet space, but it's internet space nonetheless. And most security tools and professionals of varying levels have access to that information once it's on the deep and dark web. So where we found it to be most concerning is when it's before it shows up on the deep and dark web, where sophisticated criminals are more likely to use it for targeted attacks, very much similar to the types of attacks that you guys witnessed. And that's harder to detect. And usually the lag time between a breach occurring and it showing up in a place that's publicly accessible is upwards of 34 months on average. I throw out some of the outliers. We have a really nice slide that shows this. We have one that's like 71 months that we saw it on the underground and the criminal sharing area before it showed up on the deep and dark web, and one was I think 12 months. If you cut out those as outliers, it's about 18 months is about the period of time that information is out there being actively used and completely invisible to most security professionals.
Yeah, that's incredible. So Damien, this one was asked in reference to you and the restaurant operators, right? So informing the front lines of your organization about security changes and sort of cultural shifts around security. What do you think is the best way to inform your front lines? And I'll kick it off with Damien to answer that one.
Yeah, I think there has to be a communication strategies, right? So when you talk with the board or the strategic group that's going to kind of collaboratively make the decision, then what we did was we sent out included notes in our weekly operational memos, because the operators read that religiously, right? Because it's important to the day-to-day. And so we would integrate security type, high-level security type of notifications in that notification. And then we would come up with a timeline, for example, two-factor authentication. We're going to implement this change. We're starting with this group as a test group, most of the time the IT group, and then we're moving to this group, and this group, and this group. And so we would have a timeline on technology rollout or control rollout. And then that seemed to be sufficient on making the changes and providing that needed notification. And then finally, instead of it just being a one-time thing, we would do at least quarterly notes that says, hey, continue to be on the lookout for this. We've seen these particular examples. And then at any conferences that I spoke at for the company, we did an annual leadership conference. I had a speaking part to all the leadership management there to say, hey, take these nuggets of information and bring it back to your employees.
For sure. Harry, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple things. I mean, one is we tried to keep any messages on change short, and we tried to get somebody that wrote English, not technical, to write them. And then we would train anything that was affected end users. We would enlist representatives from every department, train the trainer, so there was experts on the change in the business unit that they could go to, so we weren't overwhelmed. If the change was something that affected how they did their job, we would build a layered rollout with train the trainers by department or by division.
We had a question about any third parties that you used around security training or awareness. Is that the case here? Was a third party?
For security training, we essentially, I mean, so much of the training in a healthcare company is mandated by the HIPAA regulations so a lot of our training had pieces we had to have versus pieces we wanted to have. We would have third party build it, but it was really our story. We usually wrote those in-house, but had somebody construct them for us.
Makes sense. We actually have two questions about sort of third-party risk. And so
Yeah.
there's a question about, what if it's a vendor that I'm using for a hosted application? How do I go about informing, my customers that a vendor of mine has been breached? Do you have any comments on that, Harry? You want to start?
We had talked when we were preparing this. One of the topics we didn't get into was how do you deal with trading partners? And a hosted vendor is just one kind of trading partner. In a complex company like healthcare, we probably shared data with 150 other companies that either were customers of ours or companies that did services for us like pharmacy benefits or mental health benefits. So you never know where the breach is going to happen. I mean, you've got to be able to kind of communicate and take responsibility at the same time because it's your vendor in many cases. So if it's your cloud vendor, you can't point the finger and say, not me. You've got to kind of own up that's the vendor I chose or we chose. But you've got to somehow then at the same time in your messaging place legal blame because you don't want to get sued through this if it's a cloud vendor. But so it's that delicate balance of accepting responsibility, but also explaining where the breach occurred or where the risk occurred.
For sure. Damien, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do sometimes is as we're negotiating either initial contracts or follow-on renewals with vendors, this doesn't always work, by the way, but if they're providing, for example, a security service, right, then some of that risk can be transferred. Because if you're telling me, I'll tell you this, as a CISO, as vendors come in to pitch their particular service or product, everybody comes in is better than everybody else, right? I'm better than this guy or this company. We're the best, right? Well, if you're the best, then in this contract that we're going to sign, you're going to tell me that you're liable for at least the amount of money we're spending with you in the event that you have a breach and it impacts us. Now, it's hard to get that past the legal folks on both sides, but that's one approach I took. The other approach is if you're a vendor sharing data or providing some other type of service, what security controls do you have in place? Have you been tested? How are you monitoring? How are you protecting your data? I want to see all that before I hand you my data.
And I would just add one point. If you can build into the contracts, you should build in the right to audit their security posture and their controls.
Absolutely. So since we're running into the top of the hour, I want to end by asking if you have any words of encouragement for teams that are going through this right now, because I would imagine that that's a significant portion of folks who have showed interest in this webinar. So, Harry, I'd love to hear your perspective.
I think, I always said as a leader, they didn't hire me for the good times. They hired me when things got rough. And that's really when you lead. So I think this is the time to lead. This is the time. And the truth is, you may not know a lot of stuff, but you still have to lead through the crisis and learn and lean on the experts in your company and outside your company. But the way you survive is by leading through the crisis as best you can.
Absolutely. Damien, what do you think? I think you might be muted.
Yeah, I would say that,
Oh,
I would echo Harry's sentiment there. I would also add that, oh, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So I would also add, I'll echo Harry's sentiment, but I would also add that as you're looking at modernizing your infrastructure from an IT perspective, see where you can shift things to reputable cloud dealers, reputable cloud vendors, right? And the reason why I say that is because the Amazons, the Microsoft, the Oracles of the world, they have strong, smart, large security teams. At Landry's, I did not. I consider myself intermediate when it comes to technical skill sets of a CISO, but those guys would run circles around me. So I want them to take care of that. So that's what you call risk transference, right? If my host is sitting in Microsoft or Amazon's cloud, the security controls around that generally are better than what I can provide on-prem.
Yeah, lean on experts for sure. Well, I would like to thank all of you. Thank you so much for being on this panel and providing all this advice to all the folks who joined us today. And thank you to everybody who spent the last hour with us. If we didn't get to your question, we're going to respond to you personally. And I just invite everybody to, like Damien said, lean on your experts. SpyCloud would love to be here to help you through the situation that you may be facing when it comes to a breach. And I encourage you to just go to spycloud.com, sign up for that free breach monitoring, see what our data is like, and reach out if there's anything else we can help with. But thank you, everybody. And yeah, hope to hear from you soon. Thanks, guys.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.